This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.
Hey, this is Erin with Cornell Studio Supply, located in the Gem City of Dayton, Ohio. As a proud sponsor of this episode and the Brickyard Network, we are happy to help you with all your pottery and ceramic sculpture needs by providing the best customer service and world-class workshops. Join us January 17th to the 19th for a hands-on dual workshop with Dita Mert and Jeremy Randall. Visit cornellstudiosupply.com to sign up. At Cornell Studio Supply, we are owned and operated for potters by potters.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 536 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I am joined by Brian Nettles, who is a potter and educator based in Pass Christian, Mississippi, an area that was hit hard by a 35-foot storm surge during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. We start our interview talking about the history of ceramics in southern Mississippi and the influence that bayous and cypress swamps have had on his aesthetic. The second part of our interview focuses on his experience rebuilding his home and studio after Katrina, as well as tips for navigating recovery resources after a natural disaster. I thought after the recent Hurricane Helene that went through western North Carolina, it might be interesting to talk to someone who has survived a hurricane and has now rebuilt his life and business into a thriving state today. In addition to his own studio, Brian was the studio director of ceramics at the Orr O'Keefe Museum of Art in Biloxi, Mississippi, from 1997 to 2005. If you'd like to see examples of his work, you can check out his website. That's nettleспottery.com. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Well, let's start talking about ceramics in southern Mississippi in general. What are the traditions or the famous folks that people might know from your region?
The Mississippi Gulf Coast area has a long tradition of art pottery, going back to the 1800s. There was a family in Biloxi, the Myers family, Joseph Myers, and he was friends with George Orr as a child growing up, and they were from France, and they got wiped out in a hurricane. And Joseph Myers' father went to New Orleans and started a pottery there to help support the family and selling pottery in the French market. And that's how George Orr got into pottery, was through Joseph Myers. They were childhood friends. And George Orr's father was a blacksmith. George didn't want to do blacksmithing, so he went and worked with Joseph. And the Woodward brothers, who started Newcomb, that's now Newcomb Pottery. They started a school. There was two brothers. It was after the Civil War. They came down to New Orleans and started teaching women how to paint on pottery to give them a way to make money. And Joseph Myers, who they hired as the potter, hired George Orr to come over and make clay, load kilns, and turn pots. And they would turn pots, and then the women would decorate them at Newcomb Pottery. And that's where George Orr got his start in pottery. And then from there, George Orr, of course, got dismissed from Newcomb, and he traveled around for 7 years and then came back to Biloxi and started his pottery in Biloxi. So it's got a long history. And then there was a potter, the Peter Anderson is called Shearwater Pottery in Ocean Springs, and that's where I'm from, is Ocean Springs, Mississippi, and which is just over the bridge from Biloxi. And the Anderson family, there was three brothers, and they had a summer home in Ocean Springs. Their father was in New Orleans, and Peter Anderson was sailing one day, and Joseph Myers had come back and had a summer home on Deer Island, island off the coast of Mississippi. And Peter met Joseph Myers, and he got turned on to pottery. And Joseph told him to go to Alfred and study. So he actually went and studied with Charles Benz at Alfred. And then, so he came back to Ocean Springs and opened up pottery in 1928. And by then, Orr had died. And while Peter was studying at Alfred, his mother bought George Orr's wheel. And they actually started Shearwater Pottery on George Orr's wheel. And so that was in 1928. And so there was a lot of going back and forth from New Orleans and the coast here. We're only, like my house right now is 60 miles from Bourbon Street in New Orleans. So it's pretty close. It's almost a suburb. So back in the 1800s, there were trains used to run daily back and forth. And so people went back and forth into there. So it's a long history of art pottery here on the Mississippi coast.
We should bring up that you were the head of ceramics at the Orr O'Keefe Museum, the studio that was there for quite a while, right?
9 years. I'd started my studio here in Pass Christian in 97, and they had the George Orr Cultural Center, which had been a few years, and it was in the back of an old library. And so that's why I guess I know a lot about the Orr story. But they started the George Orr Cultural Center. A wonderful woman named Margie Gowdy. She was the executive director. She literally started it on her own credit card, and she built it up. And she kept telling me, they were going to have a new building one day, and they were going to start a clay program. She finally taught me into coming over and teaching classes. So I went over and started their clay program, teaching classes, workshops, curating ceramic shows, different things. But she was good in the fact that she wanted me to stay as an artist. So I only had to go over 2 days a week, and I'd go over and I'd work like 12, 15-hour days, and I'd teach classes, go to meetings, and the rest of the time I worked in my studio, and then writing grants and that kind of stuff I could do at home on my own time. She didn't want me to become just sit behind a desk kind of artist. She wanted me to stay as a functioning artist, which was good. And so, yeah, I got to start the clay programs at the George Orr Museum, called the Orr O'Keefe Museum of Art in Biloxi. And started the workshops. I got to curate some collections, curate all the ceramic exhibitions leading up to it. And then we got Frank Gehry involved. And so I actually got to work with Frank Gehry in designing the ceramic studio and the kilns, shed, and everything they have going there.
What a great experience to not only be so tied to the local history through George Orr, but also to work with Frank Gehry. I mean, that's like a once in a lifetime type thing.
It was. I was fortunate. I had actually started studying architectural engineering in school, and I probably should have went to architecture school, but I went to engineering school to begin with. And so, of course, he was always on my radar as being an architect. So, yeah, it was pretty amazing for him to come. And something interesting about Gary, I got to spend quite a bit of time with him. He started out studying ceramics at the University of Southern California, and the glaze guy at Southern California. What is his name? Glenn Lukens. Yeah, that Frank Gehry was Glenn Lukens' studio assistant. He was in a third-year ceramics program, and Glenn Lukens had ore pots on his desk, and so Gehry knew who Orr was going back into the 50s or so, and knew who George Orr was due to Glenn Lukens having ore pots. So that's how he got his start. He was actually real good friends with a bunch of different potters all in Southern California over the years. And Frank actually told me when he went with Glenn Lukens, was having a new home being built, and he rode with him to go see this new home. And on their way back, Glenn Lukens looked at him and said, "Frank, you need to go study architecture. You're more turned on about architecture than you are clay." And that's when he went and changed his major and went into architecture from Southern California.
Oh, God. I mean, think about a future Or think about a past in which he didn't do that. Like, I'm sure he'd been an amazing ceramic artist also, but he's been such an influential architect that I'm glad that Glenn Lukens had that insight.
Yeah, no, it was a pretty amazing story. Yeah, and he was telling me about it. I was fortunate in a lot of ways. When he would come to town, they would always send me over to pick him up at the airport in New Orleans. So I'd ride back with him coming from New Orleans when he'd come do site visits and different things, different meetings. I got to go out to Los Angeles to his studio and prove drawings and that kind of stuff. So it was pretty fun to get to see all that.
For folks that haven't been to your part of Mississippi, can you describe the landscape and sort of how close you are to the ocean and the bayous and like that sort of wetlands area?
Mississippi is about 40 miles across the Gulf from Bay St. Louis to Pascagoula. From state line to state line, about 40 or 50 miles. And it's all along the Gulf front, the Gulf of Mexico. There's a 26-mile white sand beach going along the waterfront there. And my house is actually 5 miles inland off the beach. And there's bayous and rivers and everything that goes into bays and all leading out to it. So it's very wooded, kind of river bottoms, bayous, swamps. I have 30 acres here. I have red cypress swamps on my property. I backed up to a river. So it's very wetlands, I will say.
Once you got this land, you built your house, right?
Yep. That's what I started out in architectural engineering in college. I was a senior when I changed my major, and I had always built things. And so my wife and I, we camped out and hand built our house from the ground up, built everything.
When you're in a swamp, sounds like a dumb question, but I'm from the mountains, so I don't know how all this works. When you're in an area that has so much swampland, how do you find the right building spot so that you know you're not going to have just natural water encroaching as water levels rise?
Well, that's what I bought this about 25, 26 years ago. I've been on this same piece of property. And so it has changed in my lifetime, which is amazing to see. But I did have the property was surveyed. I have 30 acres. So the survey, it tells you what is in a flood zone, what is not in a flood zone, elevation, and everything. So I built my house on the 30 acres outside the flood zone. And it was high enough where it had never flooded before. There was Hurricane Camille came through here in the late 60s, and the flood waters was about 13 feet above sea level. So that was the benchmark for my area, was to build everything above 13 feet above sea level, because that Camille was the largest storm. It was never going to happen again. And then in 2005, of course, Katrina came. So yeah, that's kind of the lay of the land here.
How have you been able to digest the land in terms of your artistic influence? Because I'm sure there's like tons of wildlife, a lot of grasses, a lot of tree, like there's a lot around you. How have you been able to bring that into your studio aesthetically?
Yeah, that's what, when I bought the land, I bought 30 acres. I put my house and studio right in the middle of it. So I have no neighbors in sight. It's all wooded. There's cypress swamps, white cypress trees, all the animals that come with it. Birds, a lot of wildlife, alligators, everything on our property. So that's what I have trails cut through the property that I walk in every day, kind of walk around. And so that's where, the colors of palmetto plants and just all the nature around me is what I see, which that blends into the work of my pottery.
I know you've done atmospheric firing for a long time. How did you get turned on to that?
When I first started ceramics, I went to school at University of Southern Mississippi in Hattiesburg. And when I first started the clay program, the professor was about to build a groundhog kiln. This was back in the late 80s. So there wasn't a lot of internet. There wasn't a lot of more technology. And he had an old film from the Foxfire Museum out of, I believe, North Georgia, the Foxfire Museum. They had these Foxfire books, and they had the Metters family. And so we, just from the Foxfire book, we built a groundhog kiln, and we threw in tons of salt and got real juicy. So that was my very first ceramics class, was building a groundhog kiln and wood firing in it. So I continued firing that, and then also built a couple other wood kilns while I was in college. and I just always liked to build, so kiln building came naturally to me. So that's just from the very beginning, from salt firing and then soda firing, and then once, and again, back, you got to keep putting this in time perspective and how fast technology goes. But in the late 80s, there wasn't internet. And so there was only books, Daniel Rhodes books and different books on Japanese pottery. And so that's what I was always intrigued by, Anagama kilns. And there, that time period, there wasn't a ton of them like there is today in the country. And so I was always fascinated with Anagama and the historical Japanese pottery, just from reading books and studying. So then in, I think, 99, I eventually had an opportunity to go to Japan and went and studied in Japan. There was a workshop called IWCAT in Tokonami, and it was a residency kind of workshop. And so I went there for 2 months, and from there, we fired a lot of Anagama kilns, and I met people, and Leia stayed with it on the gallery. And so they invited me back to have a show, make work. So I'd go back and make work in Tokonami, in Koji Sugio's studio, and get to make work and fire Anagamas there.
When you built I think you have multiple kilns, but when you built the big kiln, it's an Anagama. So what is it that you like about that shape versus, say, most people don't build groundhogs now because they're hard. You know what I mean? Like, they're hard to control. But what is it about an Anagama specifically that you like?
Well, I built Anagama. I was built in about 2000, I think. In 2000, I was about 24 years old. And I built it as a tube kiln. In Tokonami, you see in Japan the kind of well-shaped shigaraki style Anagamas that kind of had the big belly, swollen belly. And that was the kind of kilns that most Americans were building. And after I went to Tokonami, it was basically a groundhog kiln, a tube kiln with side stoping ports. And so that's what I came back and built. My kiln was more of a tube kiln, just a straight tube, and it doesn't have the swollen kind of well belly that you traditionally see in like Jack Troy's kiln and different types of kilns at that time period. There is more and more tube style kilns in the Anagama world now. But I like the variety of the pots I was getting. Up front, I could get some really crusty, ashy pots. And then in the back, I would put a lot of Shino kind of glazeware back there to help. I have to make a living, so I would put a lot of functional stuff in there in the back end where it didn't get as ashy and crusty. So I get to make the pots that make my heart sing up front, and then the pots in the back to pay the mortgage.
That's a good way to look at it. I love that very back part of an Anagama where you get the ash that's so fine that it's just like barely there. But there's a potter I think she's in Connecticut, Joy Brown, who's a sculptor and has made vessels. And I remember looking at the pots that came out of that section, and it's almost like magic because it's like a mist of dust. It's not harsh. And it's also a verticality to it that's just so specific. Like, you just can't get it any other way.
I'll put a red Shino in the back there. So when that, I call it like snowflake ash, comes down, lands on it, it just embeds into that Shino. And exactly what you're saying, it's not real directional other than it's just kind of landed on the shoulders of everything. Kind of more like a soft snowstorm coming down.
So part of your studio is also a teaching studio. When did you decide that you wanted to have teaching be like a core part of your studio?
Well, that was never, when I bought the property, it was never my intentions to have a teaching studio. When I bought the property and built my personal studio here, I was working at the Ore Museum. So I was teaching classes over there, and I wasn't planning on being there forever. I was there for 9 years, which building the Gary Museum took a lot longer than expected. Fundraising and the way it's built with ground trees and everything took a lot longer. So I stayed there, and my plan was to stay there. And we're 9 months away from opening the Ore Museum when Katrina hit. And so I was planning on getting the new museum open, spend a year or two, and then I was going to quit teaching and come back and just make pots was my plan. And then in 2005, so we're 9 months away from the grand opening. We were already having pots shipped in, and we had plans. Jasper Johns was going to be in the main gallery, and we had the pots that he used to paint. In some of his paintings, he painted ore pots, and there's still lifes. And so we had his paintings with the ore pots that he had painted were going to be in the show. So, I mean, we had a plan when Katrina hit. And so that's when that got destroyed, of course. And so after Katrina, I had some of my students that Katrina got totally destroyed. They let everybody go except the executive director because they're working out of a FEMA trailer. So I had got my studio up and going, and some of my students wanted to continue taking classes. So this was like a year later after Katrina, 2006. And so I needed money to help rebuild. So I started teaching classes, and my studio was small. It was 24 by 24. It wasn't large. And I was, production potter, making lots of pots. So I was planning on doing it for a little while. Well, the students kept coming, more students, more classes. And so I finally said, either you guys have to leave or we got to build a new studio. And they opted to help me build a new studio. So most of them are still coming today. So I built a 3,600 square foot metal building studio that we teach classes. I have private studio rentals and everything in it. So it's been good. I enjoy teaching. I do.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com.
The Bray Clay business is your best source for Bray epoxy, a two-part moldable epoxy intended for post-firing repairs. Working like clay, it's easy to shape, texture, fill gaps, and recreate missing parts. Bray epoxy is sold in tan, white, and black base colors, and we also have a 9-color kit that will allow you to perfectly disguise your repair. Order online anytime at archiebrayclay.com.
Before Katrina actually hit, did y'all know that it was going to be as bad as it ended up being?
No, never expected. Like I said earlier, the benchmark here was Camille put 13 feet of water, 13 feet above sea level got wet. Anything that was below 13 feet above sea level got wet. Katrina on my property was 35 feet above sea level.
Oh, wow.
So that's the difference of what the benchmark was and how bad it was. The Camille was the worst storm to ever hit America until Katrina, and then with the flood. And so it was basically, Katrina was like just a tidal wave, just a tsunami came in, destroyed our town, destroyed my house, studio, the War Museum. And then it was just basically a big wave came in, destroyed everything, and then kind of stayed for a couple hours and then receded. And that's all it took to destroy it.
And that was all storm surge that came onto land?
Yeah. Basically a 35-foot wave, like a tsunami, just came ashore. And I mean, there was concrete condominiums, 5-story condominiums that were wrecked, looked like a wrecking ball knocked them to the ground. I mean, the power of water is just absolutely staggering. And that's how the Ore Museum is on the beachfront. And so there is casinos here. And when they first started the casinos, the gaming part of the casino had to be on a boat. It was some crazy law Mississippi lawmakers made. It had to be on a boat. So they have hotels and everything around it, but the actual gaming part was built on barges. And one of the casino barges, which I never dreamed they would float, actually floated and landed on top of the Ore Museum. So it actually had a big steel barge with 3-story buildings built on it, floated, came about a mile away and landed on top of the Ore Museum. Wow. How it got destroyed.
Well, how do you recover from that?
A long time. I had a commercial building downtown where I had originally started my studio, and then I had my house and studio here. My house got ripped in half. The water, it's built up off the ground. I'm 4 feet off the ground on piers. And so half of it got ripped off and floated about 50 feet. I had a commercial building downtown, and it was a slab of concrete. There was a 2-car automotive garage, and it was a block off the beach. It was a slab of concrete. There was nothing left. In my little town, past Christiane, there's 7,500 homes, and there were 500 still standing. And most of them got wet in some degree, but there's 500 still standing out of 75. 100% of the commercial district was gone. So basically, essentially, the entire town was wiped off the map. I mean, commercial and residential. So it's pretty devastating. Where in the days following, it was just survival mode, just pure survival for months, really. I went 36 days before we ever had power. My well got contaminated, so I went over a year without drinkable, potable water. And then, like, to go to Home Depot, Lowe's, anything like that, any kind of hardware store, to get any kind of building materials was at least 2 to 3 hours away. And so you couldn't drive easily because the whole region was destroyed. 90 miles to the east, 90 miles to the west, 100 miles plus north was all destroyed. So it was just everything. I mean, we lived off the military. Once they did come, the National Guard, they started dropping off bottled water and MREs, these military kind of survival meals. So we lived on those for quite a while. Several weeks, we just ate MREs. It's all we had. There's no restaurants, no food. So, it's not a quick recovery when you have something like that.
As you're talking about that also, like I think there was so much focus in Katrina on New Orleans specific because from a news standpoint, the news anchors could just go and show you these houses that were knocked down. But when you're talking about like 90 miles north or not, 90 miles in all directions being affected by this, that's an economic depression. I mean, that essentially is one storm that created that much devastation. So let's talk about like being a year out from the storm. I know it's hard to think backwards in this artificial timeline, but can you think about like what you were doing a year after the storm hit?
Immediately after the storm, I had a 2-year-old, my wife. We lived in a tent. I had a friend came and actually lived in my Anagama for about 6 months. He put a tarp over the front of the Anagama, lived in it. And he and I went out and started cutting trees, gutting houses, doing work because I just lost all my kilns, everything to make a living. So we started repairing houses and doing tree work, gutting, they call it gutting houses out that got wet, and getting the sheetrock and everything out. And then during that time, I was actually thinking I was going to become a contractor because there was over 90,000 homes in my area destroyed. So I'm thinking, get my contractor's license. I got a 2-year-old, maybe possibly another baby on the way, living in a tent. I got to do something. So pottery wasn't high on the list. And I had a guy, this is how fortunate it is. His name's Jerry Wagner from Pennsylvania. And he worked for a company called Danzer Incorporated. And they build industrial kilns. And he called me one day. He said, "Brian, this is Jerry Wagner. I heard about you losing your studio. I'm going to donate a 64 cubic foot gas reduction kiln, 64 advancer kiln shelves, and I'm going to ship it down to you." And back then you had flip phones. I hung up. I'm like, okay, this guy's crazy. I went back to gutting houses. And several months went by, and phone rings, calls back, and he's, "Hey, this is Jerry. You got pots made? You ready? I'm shipping that kiln down. I'll be down in 2 weeks. We're going to hook it up. I'm going to fly down, hook it up, and fire it for you." I'm like, "Who is this? What are you doing?" He said, "I called you a couple months ago. I told you I'm building a kiln." I'm like, "Really? You're doing that?" He said, "Yeah." So I had to go and repair my studio here at the house, got sheetrock, fixed it, went and bought a wheel, bought a little electric kiln, made 64 cubic foot of wear, just fired it. Here he showed up with a 53-foot truck, forklift, and brought a 64 cubic foot gas kiln in my studio and hooked it up and fired it the first time.
Wow.
And then from there, and they build industrial kilns like for tile companies, brickyard companies, big multi-million-dollar kiln. So he called all his suppliers, and they donated, like the steel company, the fiber company, the brick company, the 64 Advancer shells. He had just built a tile kiln for a company, and he had ordered an extra pallet, and they had just extra pallets sitting there he knew about. So they had shipped that. So he called all his suppliers and everybody he knew in the industry and built the kiln and then shipped it down. Is how I got my start back.
How did he know you needed help?
It's stroke of luck. Back before Katrina, there was a woman in Southern California named Elaine Levin. She wrote books, The Mover and Shakers in Pottery. There's a series of books. She was an older lady back then. And she had come down and interviewed me, stayed for 2 or 3 days with me, and was writing an article on me in the Ore Museum and for Ceramics Monthly. And just as Katrina hit, the article was at the printers for Ceramics Monthly. And people at Ceramics Monthly called them and said, hold this article. We don't know if Brian's alive or dead. So they pulled the article out of the magazine. And then she got in touch with the director at the Ore Museum and heard about me losing everything. And she wrote back to Ceramics Monthly and said, he's alive. He just lost everything. So in the Ceramics Monthly articles, they went ahead and ran the article. And at the end, they said, Brian just lost everything in Katrina. So Jerry, who was at a summer home in Maine, was still he's a potter, but he works for this kiln company. He went to Alfred, but he works for this kiln company, designing building kilns. And so he was still reads Ceramics Monthly, and he read about it in Ceramics Monthly. Is how he heard about me, and got in touch. So yeah, it was pre really the internet. There wasn't Facebook and all that way back then. So that it was just through a little blurb in Ceramics Monthly that he found me.
And it re-solidified clay as your path, because I'm sure if that kiln didn't show up, you might have gone with the contracting route.
Yeah, no, and I still some days scratch my head what happened. But yeah, no, he's the full-time potter today. Because I definitely was not looking at getting my studio up and going. And once I got that kiln up and going, I offered it to a bunch of potters around. So I think I had 12 to 15 potters that would come out and fire and use the kiln until everybody got their studios built back and going again. So I just opened it up to everybody since I was fortunate enough to be given a kiln. So there's a bunch of potters came and used it for years afterwards to fire it, get their work going, to make work.
I feel like when people see a natural disaster, their instinct is to give money, which is good. People need the money. They need the immediate support. But before we started recording, one of the things you mentioned is that people also need long-term support. But it's maybe harder to codify that. So can you talk about like the things that you needed a couple years out that you didn't necessarily need in the beginning?
Yeah, that's what in the beginning you need just cash, and that's what, like in this day and age, what just happened in North Carolina, and it happened down in Florida too. I mean, it hit Florida and moved all the way to North Carolina. So all through Georgia, there's people's studios wrecked. But just a conglomerate of potters and artists around Western North Carolina got destroyed. So that's what immediately, cash is king. You're just trying to survive, trying to pay the bills. I mean, when my house got destroyed, I'd just taken out a mortgage on it. I had a 30-year mortgage, so I still had 27-year mortgage, and the house is destroyed. I didn't have flood insurance. So I'm still paying a mortgage living in a tent, still paying insurance living in a tent, and you just shake your head. So that was the immediate, was just needing that. And then SURF, which is an amazing organization that always donate to them. They, Cornelia Carey, she was the executive director at the time. She recently retired. She was amazing. But they gave some grant money, cash grant money, and then they orchestrated manufacturers and distributors donated clay, like high water clay. Brian McCarthy, they donated a 53-foot truckload of clay about a year after to help get started. Scott had donated some kilns through Craft Emergency Surf. They donated kilns. So all that kind of got distributed down here through Surf. And then That was probably a year or so after all that was taking place. And then it kind of dries up. And that's where, people had offered me all kind of opportunities to come, you know, come work here, come do this, come teach here, come. And at the time when it first immediately happens, the first year really, um, you don't, you're dealing with bullshit. You're dealing with insurance. You're dealing with FEMA. You're dealing with trying to survive. So I couldn't leave. I couldn't go do things. I couldn't because I was home dealing with, family, insurance claims, adjusters, everything. And so it was that long term where I think it's important to continue to think about people and give them opportunities with what happened in North Carolina. I see these GoFundMe's that have amazing amounts of money people getting donated to, which is incredible. But it's the long term effect that they need assistance because it takes years. I mean, some days Katrina seems to me like it was yesterday, and some days it seems like a lifetime ago. But I can walk around my property and I still see damage. There's still things on my house, my property that's broken from Katrina 19 years plus after. So it is that long-term help that people are going to need in North Carolina and reaching out to them.
You mentioned that your kid was pretty young when Katrina happened. How did you and your wife provide some stability in the midst of all that chaos for your child?
He's a trooper. My wife had taken him to her mother, who was about 90 miles inland, and during Katrina, and then once I got in touch with her and told her our house was destroyed, she came down, checked it out, but their house was destroyed up there as well from tornadoes, not trees and stuff down. So the first time he came back, we had gutted the house, all the insulation, sheetrock, everything, wood cabinets were all torn out. So he came running through as a 2.5-year-old running through, and he's like, "Oh, house is broken," and his room was sitting on the ground, So, and then we lived in a tent for several months, and then eventually, maybe 6 months later, we got a FEMA trailer, like just a travel trailer they brought on your property. And so we lived in that as we rebuilt our house. But he still remembers it. I mean, he still remembers different parts of it. Playing outside. Living in it through the winters. It does get cold here, not as cold where you're at. But living, in a trailer and playing outside around campfires through the winter and stuff. He definitely remembers it. He's 21, working on 22 years old now. So he still talks about it.
Because I think about the timing of this, like it happens in August and, when it's still hot, but pretty soon you're into winter. So, I mean, it's so great that FEMA could provide a trailer eventually. How do you negotiate with FEMA? Like, how do you actually deal with that process of getting support and actually from the Mississippi state government as well?
It's difficult because FEMA, back then, especially you had flip phones. They wanted you to do emails, which they don't realize people are living in trucks, living in vans, living in tents. My friend was living in Anagama, and they want you to fill out forms and do this. And it's like, man, you go stand in lines for hours and, then you don't have this form. You don't have this form. Well, it just got washed away. We don't have forms because we don't have it. If we don't have our insurance policy, the insurance agent is washed away. I mean, it's just the compounding frustration. And FEMA was, I can't say bad about it. We got some money out of FEMA. And then eventually, years later, the federal government gave money to the state government, which then trickled down to the people. But it took years. And, they had grant money, which you had to apply for and show a need. And it was a portion of your total losses that you got a portion. So it was never, you're not 100%. I'll tell you, my uninsured losses after insurance, after grants, after everything through the state and FEMA, we lost $459,000 of uninsured losses. So it's that, that's a lot of money for a potter. I make my living 100% from ceramics, and I never even dreamed that I had that. Well, that was what everything I owned was worth. And so it's just a huge financial loss that compounds the rest of your life,
Yeah, let's talk about how that affected future savings. How old were you at the time?
I was in my mid 30s at the time. I'm 57 now. So
How did that reset the way you were thinking about saving for retirement or just creating a nest egg to live from now, at that time in your 30s?
you take a financial hit like that. And that's one thing I think is great about the GoFundMe's and everything now. I mean, I lost $459,000. I mean, that's to anyone. I don't, if you're rich or poor, which I'm on the lower end, that's a lot of money. We owned a commercial building that was washed away, got zero from insurance. My house was ripped in two. My studio out here had water over the roof. My insurance, State Farm, my insurance company gave me $1,200. $1,200 is how much I got because I didn't have flood insurance. Which I did. They told me 2 years previous when I switched from builder's risk to homeowners, I didn't need flood insurance, and then so I didn't have flood insurance. So $1,200 to put my kiln shed roof back on, and they wouldn't give me the $1,200 until I screwed metal back on my roof where my kiln was. I washed away. So it's kind of ironic. You have to laugh at this point, you just laugh. But yeah, no, it set you back. So I had to still pay a mortgage and then turn around and buy materials to rebuild my house. So it's, you're basically paying for it twice, which sets you back your retirement, your savings, your everything. I'll be making pots till I die.
Did it affect the way you trust insurance companies? Because I think I would maybe not trust insurance companies after that.
No, I am not a fan of insurance companies. I am not a fan. They always have an excuse. The year Katrina hit, State Farm posted a $7 billion profit. $7 billion profit. They could have put $1 billion down here, made everybody whole, and still made $6 billion, but they didn't. And they actually got sued because they had a plan. They had some secretaries that in the executive office that said that what do you call them? They ratted them out and said they told all the adjusters to deny everything. And so they actually State Farm got sued for like $1 billion, but of course we never saw the money. Lawyers or somebody got it. So yeah, I'm not a fan of insurance, but I've actually become like an insurance expert because of that. I have insurance on everything now, but even if I got destroyed again, I wouldn't think I'd ever get money. I would never count on giving me money. I'll say that. They find ways not to pay.
How do you think people can prepare for natural disasters? Like, do you have any tips for preparing your studio or your life?
Yep. One thing is we worked with Surf, and they have this document. I forget what it's called off the top of my head, but they took all the things after Katrina. One thing was after Katrina was, my computer was washed away. So everything I had no, like my portfolio back then, it was slides. So all my earlier work, I lost all documentation. So, keeping, and now with, computers and storage, iCloud, all that, it's a lot different, but definitely keep things, all your important documents like that stored off site somewhere to help save all that. I've been living out here in the woods on a river in the swamps for almost, 30 years now. And it's changing. I mean, the climate, the rivers are getting higher, the higher tides are higher, the water, everything, the storms are stronger. It's definitely changing. So, I'm a firm believer now in everybody having flood insurance. I mean, who would ever thought people in North Carolina in the mountains needed flood insurance? But I'd be willing to bet their insurance. I haven't talked to really anybody up there, but people that's homes, businesses got flooded that had insurance, they didn't have flood insurance. So they're going to be denied. They're not going to get any insurance money. And that's, flood insurance is cheap if you don't need it. If you live in the mountains, you don't need flood insurance mostly. So it's cheap. And, if you can afford it, it's probably worth having flood insurance, even if your agent tells you, oh, you don't need it, don't waste your money. They have a federal policy through FEMA. And I recommend getting it. At the time when Katrina hit, it would have been like $300 a year for me. And now it's almost $6,000 or $9,000 a year because they moved me into a flood zone. But Yeah, I mean, the insurance, although I'm not a fan of it, they do have the federal flood insurance program. They did pay out people that actually had it. They did pay out well. Um, so, if you live anywhere near water, I strongly recommend getting it. And even, lakes and dams breaking, lakes overflowing in storms, and then you live down the mountain from a dam, get flooded. And there's somebody in Colorado that happened to. There was a dam busted. Their house got flooded from the dam above them breaking and washed through their house, and they didn't have flood insurance. And then with the way climate is changing, it's changing. I watch it daily, changing. And so, I think it's important.
Do you think you will ever have to leave the land as the water rises, just as sea level rises?
Yeah, I do. I'm 57 years old, and it's already flooding more and more. There's a bridge on my road on the street to get to my property, and the bridge goes over a river. And when I first moved out here 26 years ago, whatever it was, 25 years ago, that bridge used to get shut down sometimes from flooding 2 or 3 times a year, and hard rains or tropical storms, it would get shut down 2 or 3 times a year, maybe once a year, sometimes never. Now, I think last year it was closed 12, 13 times in 1 year from heavy rains, the flooding, and it's sea level rise, but it's also construction, silt filling in the wetlands, different things, a lot of construction going on. All that plays into it. But the sea level, I forget how much. The Gulf here is rising faster than anywhere in the country. Is in the Gulf of Mexico right here. We're connected to Louisiana, which Louisiana has a lot of erosion problems as well as we do. So it's encroaching inland more and more. But yeah, I'll probably end up selling the property at some point, maybe sooner rather than later, due to climate change.
One of the things that you're doing to create opportunities for other people is having folks like Melissa Weiss is going to come down and do a workshop with you and your students coming up in February. And I really appreciate that you're doing that. I mean, you're really putting your money where your mouth is in terms of creating opportunities for others. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I was fortunate. People from McCarthy's that own High Water to Jim Scott that owns Scott Kilns gave me a kiln after Katrina. To Jerry Wagner gave me a gas kiln. So, I'm not a rich person, but it's a way that I can give back. So Melissa, who I kind of knew of, but didn't know her real well. So when that happened to her, got destroyed, and I know she makes her living from making pots. I reached out to her. I just sent her an email and said, when you're ready, if you want to, you're welcome to come here and make some pots and teach a workshop. I gave her a list of options of what she could do. She could come teach a workshop. She could come just make a body of work, or say no, or do it all. And she chose to do it all. So she's going to come here for a month, a little over a month, and then she's going to make my kiln 64 cubic foot, which is a pretty large kiln. It holds roughly 250 pots, give or take, depending on sizes. So she's going to come for 3 or 4 weeks and make a body of work and in my studio. And then while it's drying this fire, and she's going to teach a 5-day hands-on workshop. And so she'll get the money from that workshop. And then then she's going to glaze and fire before she leaves my gas kiln. She did cone tin reduction, and then she actually throws in some wood and kind of does reduction cooling. So she's going to make a body of work. So she'll leave with 250, 300 pots that she can go on and sell and give her some income, to get her down the road and try to, keep going is the plan. And that's one way people can reach out to artists that, you see the potters in North Carolina, some in Florida that lost it. And it's giving them the opportunity, but on their timeline. Like I saw some people were offering residencies or come work in the studio, but you had to do it before October this year. And that's what I was saying earlier, where they're dealing with insurance companies, they're dealing with, FEMA, they're dealing with trying to survive. And So that's what I gave Melissa. I said, it's open-ended. You can come anytime, pick your dates, and she found the time that would work for her when she's ready to come, and we're going to make it happen. But that's the thing, is giving them that long-term opportunity where they can figure out their schedule, their work, their life. If they have kids, they got dogs, they got animals, that they can figure out and come, and not really give them a short time period to come and do it, because the immediate aftermath is just survival mode for months, if not a year. Giving them show opportunities, giving them workshop opportunities, whatever it is you can offer in your studio. Just, I was offering Melissa to come stay with me and make a body of work. You get 300 pots, that's a chunk of change of income for, just offer something like that where they can come and use your studio and make work. And a lot of people can't leave like that. Some can, and, the ones that can take the opportunities.
To wrap up, can you plug your social media and your website so people could get in touch?
My website is nettlespottery.com, which needs to be updated, of course. And then on Instagram, I'm Nettles Pottery or Brian Nettles. And then Facebook, same thing, Nettles Pottery or Brian Nettles.
Well, thanks so much, man. It's good to meet you.
Thank you, Ben.
I'd like to thank Brian for coming on the show and for his willingness to talk about his road to recovery after Katrina. Also wanted to take a minute and thank our sponsors. We couldn't make this show or any of the ones on the Brickyard Network without their support. I'd specifically like to thank the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art, Cornell Studio Supply, and the Archie Bray Foundation. If you or your organization is interested in sponsoring an episode of the show, you can get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. We're going to be back in the middle of January with new episodes, so I look forward to talking with you again in 2025. As always, thanks for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support. Zosha, did you have something to say?
I did.
Can you say it louder?
No, you say. Can you say it to everyone?
Yeah, you're saying it to everyone right now.
Well, how do you do it?
Well, we're recording it into this, and then I'm going to put it on the podcast and everyone can hear it. So you want to say Merry Christmas?
No.
Well, Merry Christmas, everybody. We'll be back in the middle of January with new episodes. Bye.
Bye.